All right, and we are recording, and so I'm going to hand it over to Krista Sivertson, who is here to talk to us about a mid-year classroom setup and setting up your classroom with the SETT framework in mind. And she's going to share some slides with us and some really great content. So I will hand it over to you, Krista, and I will go ahead and mute myself, but let me know what you need.
Great. Well, it looks like yes, that did just pop up for me. So that's awesome. Okay. So I'm Krista Sivertson. I am the autism specialist for the Duluth Edison Charter Schools. And I'm here today to talk with you about setting up your classroom and kind of taking a look at everything mid-year. And we're using the SETT framework, which is something that we use a lot in assistive technology. Where we look at the student environment, task, and tools and look at those areas to see how they would fit our students in the AT that they need. But I thought it was kind of a good way to also look at the classroom setup as we're adjusting it in the middle of the year. And I just wanted to start out by saying that it is absolutely okay to make big changes in the middle of the year. I frequently end up doing this in part because there's often not enough time in August and September when we're getting started to do all the things that we really wanted to do. We may have had more students added to our classrooms who have different needs. Schedules are changing. Often this kind of mid-year, mid-semester break time, that can be the case. You may have had some new training this year on something that you'd like to implement in your classroom, but maybe the way that things are set up right now, it needs to be adjusted. Might have different staffing than you did before. And just kind of noticing now what's working and what's not, and what can we tweak to make that better. And I just wanted to say that it's really okay to not make all these changes all at once as well. You can prioritize what is it that you need to do the most, what do you want to start with, and go from there. So I came across this idea that a well set up classroom can be equivalent to an additional adult in your program in another training that I did. And I just found that to be fascinating. And I think it's probably true. If you've got things set up in a smoothly running room where kids who are able to be independent are independent at those times, and the materials and things are accessible to them, where routines have been learned, that could actually be the case. So if you are struggling with the support that you currently have and you're not able to get it, as I know it's a difficulty all over the state right now, consider doing some rearranging in your room and seeing if that can help. So when we start with the SETT framework, we always start with the idea of who are our students. What do they need to be able to do? What are their educational needs? And also, I think it's really important to add in what are their current abilities and their interests. If you have students who are interested in what they're doing, they're more likely to be engaged. So I'd like you to just take a minute to think about who your students are, maybe jot their names down, and any particular needs that really stand out for them right now. Especially in this mid-year, can be a hard time for some kids. So thinking about what's going on in your room, what's going well, what do your students really need, and what do they really like to do, and what are they good at? And that can kind of help set you up for thinking through the rest of what we're going to talk about today. So when we look at the environments in the classroom, there's a lot of different pieces of the environment that impact our students. The main one we'll talk about today is arrangement of the classroom, but also thinking about materials and equipment that you have, the supports that are available to your students. And one that we won't touch on as much, but it's important to think about, is the attitudes that are going on in your environment. So when you think about the classroom environment, if you've got a place that people are coming to and feeling like they know what they're doing and things are where they are supposed to be, that can add to a different attitude than people coming into a classroom where things seem kind of chaotic and they can't find what they need. So that can be a important factor to take into consideration as well. So I'd like you to take some time to sketch out what your classroom looks like. And I included some graph paper in our meeting link. So you can use any graph paper or search for one online, and just sketch out what your classroom outline looks like and any immovable features that you have. as well as making a list of any large pieces of furniture that you want to continue using. And as we go along, you're going to use this to make notes about what kind of activities would work best in what area in your room. I don't know if you hear my dog scratching in the background. Sorry about that. So think about how your space is being used, and think about the different ways that your classroom is used and the different types of instruction that are going on in there. So is it a whole group or independent workstations? Do your students have group work where they need to be at tables together? Is there a small group area where there's maybe a teacher at a kidney table? Do you need to include things like centers or a place for free choice or play? Does your classroom have a calming corner, or would you like to add something like that? And if there's any other ideas about how classrooms might be used, please feel free to add those in the chat. And we can, so that everybody has some ideas about other ways that classroom space is being used. And then also, even if you're not going to be doing any large scale rearrangement of your room, I highly encourage everyone to take the time right now in the middle of the classroom to get rid of the clutter. A clean and organized classroom is going to be so much better functioning. It's going to be easier to find things. It just makes everyone feel a little bit better when they come into a room that's organized, and you can tell what is expected in what area. So one thing that I highly recommend doing is going to the doorway of the room, closing your eyes for a second, and then opening them and noticing things that maybe you didn't notice when you're in the middle of the room and that you've kind of gotten used to. So I did this with a teacher a few years ago, and we stood in the doorway and we opened our eyes, and the first thing we saw was this file cabinet just overloaded with dirty coffee cups. And we had totally not noticed it before when we were talking about other things. It was kind of seemed to us when we were sitting at the table to be off in the corner, but it really was one of the first things we saw when we walked in the room. So using that idea of just taking a minute to reset, opening our eyes and scanning the room and looking around can be really helpful. You could bring a notepad with you when you do that and jot down some notes about the things that you want to do. Like right away, you can see maybe some cabinet doors that just are always open that need to be closed, and maybe they need a better latch. Maybe there's some shelves that could be covered that don't need to be accessed all the time or don't need to be within view. Maybe there's particular things that you could group together that are currently scattered throughout. So just using the time to kind of reset and think about those things. All right. And then think about the boundaries that are in your room. So as you think about those areas and how you want to use the space, think about how many students you have and what staffing you have available, and what could you use to show some clear boundaries in the area. So obviously you'll have your immovable walls, but then you also might have furniture, bookshelves, dividers. Maybe you have a rolling whiteboard or something that could be used to show that this area is used for something different than this area. It could also be as simple as color coding, using color-coded signs or something like that within the classroom. So if there are safety concerns, if you have students who have difficulties staying in one place, kids getting out of their location where you expect them to be, or maybe going into others' workspace or using other people's materials, visual boundaries may be something that you want to include in your classroom. And I've included a few different examples here of visual boundaries. Those include things like furniture. Then the top left, we've got kind of an independent workstation area with desks divided up using bookcases. Things like duct tape on the floor for a workspace, using open and closed signs, or a sign that says what the area is currently being used for can be helpful. Tape on the desk or a large table that needs to be shared. In the upper right-hand corner, there's an example of using some like placemat jigs for students who need to share one space, but each have a place for their own things in that space. And then stop signs are just one of my favorite visual boundary cues, and it just can help students a lot. And there's just lots of different ways that you can put them in place. when we share a visual boundary, it's important in the classroom to not just put some tape on the floor and expect that kids are going to follow that tape. We need to introduce the boundary to them, model and show what's expected, perhaps use some reinforcement to encourage them to use the boundary correctly, and then corrective feedback if they're not using it correctly. And then ultimately we want to fade those prompts. And if there are students who are moving from one classroom to another, to use those visual supports, those visual boundaries consistently across the settings so that they can generalize the idea. So while we're setting up our areas and our boundaries, we want to keep in mind that we're able to maintain supervision in all these different areas in our classrooms. So what kind of staffing do you have? Is it just you? Do you have paraprofessional support? What are the students' schedules when they're in and out of the room? And I always want to make sure that there is a line of sight from the adults in the classroom to the students. So this often looks like the teacher being placed in a corner of the classroom and looking out into the room so that they are able to look up and see what's going on. And I always make sure, like even when I set up my desk, that it is in a corner so that I can just quickly look up from anything and scan the room and be able to see what's going on. So if you are setting up barriers in your classroom, like the bookshelves, putting them in places where you're still able to view your students, or that they're low enough that you can still view your students. And just kind of reducing that line of sight between you and them. I even had one classroom where there was a weird little cubby area for coats that you couldn't see at all from most of the room. And so we set up one of those gas station mirrors up in the corner so that we could still see what was going on in the corner, even if I was in another part of the room. All right, so we're going to talk next about some of the tasks in the different areas of the classroom. And when we're thinking about tasks, think about your students and what are they working towards for their IEP goals? Are they working with anyone else? Do they need to be with a particular staff member or with a small group of students? Are they independent? And also, it's important to consider what is everyone else doing in the classroom during that time. I was helping out in a classroom and we were trying to figure out how to get a student to do his independent work tasks. And when I came in to observe, I realized that when this student had their independent work task time, the rest of this class was getting a video reward. And this student's desk was directly facing the screen. So it was basically impossible for him to focus and do his work. And it wasn't really very fair to him either. So we were able to adjust the schedule and also move his desk to a spot where it was less distractions going on. But just important to think of that as you're putting the schedules together. So when we're thinking about the different areas of the classroom and the schedule that we have going on, there's many times where one space is used for several different things. So maybe sometimes the students are at the kidney table to do a small group with the teacher, but other times they're there to do snack. Or maybe sometimes they're on the carpet reading a story, but other times they're in a circle where they have completely different expectations for interacting and participating. So making sure that if you have those kinds of areas, that each time you go to that area, there's at least a brief instruction on the expectations. So now we're in circle time, we're going to sit in our carpet spots and we're going to talk using the talking piece. Or now we're in reading time and I'm going to read and it's your job to listen and raise your hand if you have a question. So just quick reminders of those types of things. Also, if it's a flexible area where furniture is being moved, I highly recommend using some kind of visual on the floor to mark where it gets moved to and from. And ultimately, students can help with some of that if they're able. So think about, too, with these flexible spaces, how are students moving around the room? How do they come into our room? How do they leave? How do they move between activities in the classroom? And really think about what are the things that we need to teach and reinforce for them. And I really recommend practicing moving from one area to the next. Even now that you're in the middle of the school year, practicing what does it look like to get a pencil and sharpen it. What does it look like when you need to go get a tissue and throw it away? I was in a very small level 3 classroom for middle school students where they were having a number of physical altercations in part because they kept bumping into each other and getting into each other's spaces. And one of the things the teachers did was put tape down on the floor indicating which direction, like arrows, which direction they could go down this little walkway and which direction they could go down another walkway. So they knew when they stood up from their desk which way they could go. And that solved a lot of the issues of kids getting in each other's space just because they weren't needing to pass each other in these kind of small little mini hallways in the classroom. So just things like that can be helpful. So something to stop and think about as we're talking about classroom organization and setting up and kind of revamping in the middle of the school year. As we're putting all this together, think about how do you get your students to stay, to go where you want them to go? So initially, how do they get there? How do you get them to stay there once they are there? How do we get them to participate in the activities that we're doing? And then how do we also limit access to the non-teacher areas in the classroom? So those are some things that are going to be different for everyone, and I can't, answer them individually without coming into your classroom and taking a look. But one thing that we do often to get kids to stay in their spots is providing things like flexible seating. So these will look different in every classroom, and you're going to have to do some trial and error to see what works for your students. But it can be everything from just having seat cushions in a regular chair to a completely different kind of chair, like a rocking gaming chair or chair balls. I've also seen a lot of teachers using lower tables and lowering the table down to the ground so students can sit on the floor or on a carpet square or maybe on one of those seat cushions. Or using chairs that move, like the wobble stools or a rocking chair. And I've also seen whole class sets of those like Crazy Creek stadium seat folding chairs for students who are sitting on the floor a lot, just because it isn't all that comfortable to just sit crisscross applesauce on the carpet for everyone. So if you want to try to kind of maintain that interaction, those chairs can give a little bit of back support and also provide the ability to rock a little bit in your space. So there are some digital tools out there for rearranging your classroom, and I think these are just some of the best things I've ever heard of because you can rearrange an entire classroom without moving a single piece of furniture. So I used one of these when I was helping a level 3 classroom that had a very large space and some huge, huge cabinets that the custodians needed to come in and move for us to be able to set up several different possible floor plans to choose from without having to move a single thing. So I highly recommend using one of these. If you do, you definitely want to get a more exact idea of your square footage and a general idea of what size some of your furniture is. And then it'll usually let you pick from some of their like pre-set up plans. But if anybody has any other suggestions for other digital room arrangement tools, please throw those in the chat as well. These are the ones that I've found, and I know there's several apps out there for iOS and Android, and I had a favorite one that I used on my iPad, but it's now you have to pay for it, so I did not include that one on here. So something to think about too as you're thinking about the tasks going on in your classrooms, especially in level 3 classrooms, and I'm just going to say this is different in every district, but you might not have to follow the school schedule of whatever is required for everyone. So we have 50-minute periods, and there needs to be so many minutes of reading and so many minutes of math. And often in our level 3 classrooms, we can adjust a bit more to our student needs, their interests, and their ability to pay attention. So we can add in some more of those other important skills like play skills and life skills and things like that, and may not need to stick strictly to that bell schedule. And just to put out there too, we always have that unstructured downtime when we're thinking about the tasks in our classroom. So making sure that the tasks that we have set up for students during that time are meaningful, they're things that we can supervise, and they may need to be taught and practiced. Even, you can't necessarily expect some of our students to be able to sit and silently read a book. You know, we need to make sure that the books are at the level that they are able to read or enjoy. And they may not have the stamina to sit for 20 whole minutes uninterrupted, and may need to start very small and build up to that. And I also just highly recommend having some kind of a visual of what is expected during that downtime or unstructured time. So if there's something that they can do when they're done, making sure that it's really clear what it is. So just to take a minute, we've gone through a whole lot of information, and jot down kind of what your current schedule is, if you haven't already, and any changes that you'd like to make. Be thinking about those types of activities in the different spaces in your room, and the room layout, and how you want to use those different spaces. And I want you to be thinking about how you can use the furniture that you have to create those spaces. And maybe there's some things that you need that you need to kind of put an email out for, see if anybody has one sitting around, or put in a ticket to maintenance, or however you get things in your district. But be thinking about how to get the things that you need to make spaces that are uncluttered, that have clear boundaries, you're able to maintain that supervision and the traffic flow within your room. All right, so the last thing I'm going to talk about are the tools for setting up a classroom mid-year. And when I'm talking about tools here, and when we talk about assistive technology, we're usually talking about like either low-tech tools like Post-it notes or a pencil grip, or higher-tech tools like iPad. And honestly, in classroom, your learning tools are very similar. So when I'm talking about tools, I'm talking about things like pencils and crayons and books. And I'm also talking about Chromebooks and iPads and things like that you might be using, and everything in between. So I am an autism teacher, and so the first thing that I think about as a tool for a classroom is to make sure that we have our visual supports in place. So I've already talked about visual boundaries, and visual cues and visual schedules are the kind of the two top things that I would want to have set up in a classroom as kind of one of those extra tools to make sure we have everything we need. And the reason that we want to do visuals are because it's a proactive way of providing structure. It's super predictable and lets our students know what we expect, and can help support things that they just need some extra help with, like their executive functioning and time management. So if you ever have students who are feeling frustrated or anxious with their activities, if they are needing extra adult support, or if concepts are difficult for them to understand, especially when only verbal information is provided, some visuals might be helpful for them. And I've just included a few visuals for you of what those visuals might look like. And for every age and ability level, they are going to look completely different, but just wanted to give a few different examples of what they might look like for your students. Keep in mind their language level, reading ability, and things like that as you're creating your visual supports. And these last ones are some of my favorite, just for helping support students' time management. So using things like a time timer, and I know that's the one that's square and white and has the red thing in the middle. But there's also lots of digital versions that are free online, and even things as simple as making boxes and checking them off as you go to show time passing can be a really great way to support that for your students. So as you're thinking about organizing your room using visuals, one important area to remember is independent work areas that you're setting up for your classroom. If you want students to be independent, we want to make sure that they are able to follow through on a schedule on their own. So they need to know what is the work that you want them to do. And we usually have that on a little visual schedule. How much work do they need to do? And it's usually outlined by individual icons showing what activities we want them to do during that time. When are they done? It's typically when all of those visuals are gone or crossed off of their list. And then what will they do when they're finished with a task? And typically there's we'd like to end things like that with something fun that they enjoy doing, but it might not always work that way in the schedule. It is important, I think, for our students to know when they are going to get what they want in the schedule as we are thinking about reorganizing them and how we're presenting them to them. I have a student who has been really struggling a lot this year, and we weren't showing them the entire school day schedule because it was too overwhelming at first. And so we were just doing first thens. But many times the then was not a preferred activity. So getting them to do the first was kind of tough. So what we did was just simply expand the schedule a little bit more. So they now get 4 icons of what's coming up in the schedule. And we make sure that one of them in there, that something that's coming up is something that they're looking forward to. And that has really increased their ability to do those things initially that aren't necessarily the most fun. So just something to think about as you're revamping your room. You can also think about your visual schedules and how you're doing that. So visual schedules, a few examples of what those might look like. They're going to look different for every student. I have some who just need a checklist, and many who need icons and photos, who might need to pull off Velcro strips, but it could be as simple as something that's just written down or a digital checklist that they can just check off the check boxes. These are for a little more advanced students or adults. And just some considerations as you're putting visual schedules together and making sure that we're using the correct form of representation that works for your student, because not everyone needs pictures, but phrases, words might work better for them, or they might need photos or actual objects. And then again, like I explained, that the length of presentation can make a big difference for some students. So finally, when we're thinking about our learning tools and how we're setting up things in the classroom, I want you to think about where are they located and how can they be accessed by students? Are they things that you want students to be able to get to and get to gather independently? Or are they things that need to be accessed only by staff? And how are you locating those things? Are they tools that are individual or shared? And this one is, now that we're coming kind of back from COVID, previously, at least in our schools, all kids had their own separate bin where they kept all their own individual things. And now we're moving more back into, you know, the shared scissors bin or the shared markers. And so thinking about how are we using those tools, and how are we teaching students to use and put away those tools? Just things like even books and pens and pencils. Where are they located and are they accessible? And then planning ahead for things like storage. Where are things being stored that you're currently using in the classroom, and where are we going to put the things that, you know, we finished with that back in September, and you're not even going to get out that unit again until next year. Or if you have students who need devices that need to be charged, are they in a location where that can be done? Do you need to rearrange your room around where some plugins are? Do we need to get some long extension cord, what are those things called? Power strips. You know, are your students needing to log in regularly? And we need to have visual supports there for knowing how to do that. And do they have routines for getting to all these different tools? So are they able to get from one place to another in the classroom and get the things that they need independently, or do we need to set up a routine to help them to learn that? So finally, I really wish that I could say that I can give everyone here as much time as they needed to set up their classroom tomorrow and get it all ready exactly the way they want to, but unfortunately I can't. But what I hope for you is that you can take a little bit of time each day to maybe try one of these things, maybe stand in the doorway and take a look around, jot down on a list, make sketch out a layout of your classroom, and slowly work up to creating the classroom that you really want. And that's it. Thanks for coming today.
Krista, that was great. Is it okay if we open up for any questions or comments that the group has?
Absolutely.
Great. feel free to unmute yourselves or type anything in the chat window if you've got any questions or comments or examples of things that you're doing in your classroom that could be helpful.
When is this going to be available on YouTube to share with other teachers?
Great question. I just have to upload it and get it captioned. So definitely within the next few days, it should be available. And I'll be sure to send it out through that calendar invitation along with your form. So yep, you'll get a link to it.
Sweet. Yeah, I think there's a lot of teachers that would benefit from that information, and it's easier when it comes from somebody else, and not in that way, but it's like in a format that you can watch it whenever you want to, it's like instead of somebody coming to your room, it's like, yep, just watch this quick video.
Absolutely.
Sweet. Yeah, that was awesome.
Thank you.
Great. And I loved all the examples in there too, Krista. I think it was really good content that I think is going to be useful for a lot of people. Great. So I will go ahead and stop the recording, but we will hang around and see if there are any other questions, comments, thoughts. Feel free to, again, keep unmuting yourselves.